Thanks, Alberto. So this is probably going to sound like a rhetorical question for some of you, but have you ever tried to feed a baby? Raise your hand. Yes.
Yes.
I don't mean like feeding a baby, when they're nursing or taking a bottle, but have you ever gotten to the phase where they can sit up, like Renly, in a high chair, and you try to spoon feed them what is known as solid food, but really is rather some kind of mush? I never enjoyed this phase with either of our girls. It seemed to me like it was more trouble than it was worth. You could sing all the songs you want. You can talk about airplanes coming in for a landing, which the baby has no idea what you're talking about. And still, you get the closed mouth, the blank stare, or even the spoon being batted away. Yes. It's a frustrating process. Will you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm pretty sure that Paul was experiencing some of the same frustration at the point in his life when he wrote this letter to his church in Corinth about feeding an infant. Paul was bringing them along, but now he's away and hearing reports about dissension and strife in this new church he's planted. And Paul has to recognize that his message has not really stuck for most of these folks. They are acting merely human, as our translation says, which sort of throws a little shade on humans. Or another way to think of this is they're just acting on instincts, like small children. And to take nothing away from small children, it seems like the central task of being a human is to grow up. Paul would like to see some maturity amongst his Corinthian congregation, but they just don't seem to be getting it. These days, some of us may struggle with this concept as well. A few years ago, and I kid you not, I ordered a book called How to Be an Adult. Macon's not laughing. He's like, yeah, she needed that book. But it was recommended in an essay I was reading. And the hypothesis of the book is that psychological and spiritual adulthood does not automatically come with age. It requires, according to the back of the book, which is all I really read, actually, it requires ongoing and ardent work on ourselves. It involves articulating our own truth and acting in accord with its challenges. This is the kind of book you better read in spoonfuls. But I think the gist of it was that growing up involves a conscious effort, and many of us may or may not reach adulthood in our lifetime. I remember my mom would often say when I was younger, "You'll never feel any different from how you feel now. No matter how old you get, you'll still feel like the same person," and I think she added, the same person that you were in high school. Now, I don't know if Mom was completely right, and even at the time she said this, I remember thinking, this better not be true. But there is something to what she said. And as we reach middle age and beyond, we may wonder if we've grown up at all. There's a theory associated with Ken Wilber that suggests the essential task of a human life is four things: growing up, cleaning up, waking up, and showing up. You might have heard these in a different order, but I think this makes sense for the spiritual maturity that we may be seeking. So first, growing up. We all need to grow up to recognize that other people have needs. There's a psychological study of young children. Again, Renly, this is not against you. You weren't ready for the study yet. But you give them a ball, and it's red on one side and green on the other. And they can spin the ball and see that half is red and half is green. So the investigators would ask the kids that were holding the ball what color it was, green or red. And they would reply with whatever color was facing them. Then the investigator would ask, well, what color am I seeing? And the kids would invariably respond, that same color that was facing them. They couldn't conceive about what the other person was feeling or experiencing. But when they studied kids that were just slightly older, they were able to understand that if they saw a red ball, the person across from them was actually seeing a green ball. And this, my friends, seems to be the first step in growing up, seeing things from another person's perspective. The next step in the sequence is cleaning up. And I don't mean the Marie Kondo, everything in order type of way. And I've heard that Marie Kondo no longer subscribes to this after having 3 kids. She cannot keep tidy anymore. But cleaning up here in this context means looking within to see what patterns, habits, even old wounds, traumas, drive us to behave in ways we would rather not. Cleaning up means doing your own inner work so you can be free. My mom used to ask me, well, what would your mature self do? And I would be like, my mature self? Who's she? But cleaning up clears the way for the mature self to emerge. Next in Wilber's construction comes waking up. So I was listening to a podcast where Richard Rohr was commenting on this whole theory, and he said only about 15% of the people actually wake up. So what is waking up? Waking up is something that Paul had done and wanted for his people. But it's not something that you can easily convey to another person. It's something that you need to experience. Paul talks rather obscurely later on in 2 Corinthians about a time he was taken up to paradise and things were revealed to him. Paul obviously has this experience on the Damascus Road. In other words, Paul has experienced God directly. And yet, even for him, this is really hard to talk about. And he doesn't want to sound like he's boasting. He even says God gave him a thorn in his side, a physical affliction that would keep him humble. And many of us may think that the experience of oneness, the bliss that comes from a kind of spiritual experience, is not something that we can talk about. Or we may think that these experiences only belong to saints and bodhisattvas. But I would suspect that the experience of the sublime has come to many of us, even if it was just a fleeting experience. I believe we all have something of the mystic in us. Maybe we have this experience in nature, or standing by the ocean, or on a mountainside, or seeing great art, listening to classical music, or meditating, or holding a baby for the first time, or holding someone's hand when they died. Many of these experiences are born of solitude, sometimes desperation, prayer. Whatever it was, I believe these experiences are more common than we talk about. and they are what spark our continued thirst to know God. The key to any such experience seems to be the temporary elimination of the ego. Isn't that interesting? Life becomes more blissful when we stop striving, when we stop so closely identifying with our everyday wants and needs, and when we recognize our oneness with everyone. There is a story of a prince, and thank you, Jane, for this story, who was very rich and had a vast army. And one day, riding through the woods, he sees a beautiful castle. I want to live there, he thought to himself. So he rode up to the castle door and called out, "It is I, the prince. I have much to offer, many riches. I am known for my bravery, and I'm here with all my men." A voice replied, "There is only room here for one of us." The prince pondered what had happened. Leaving dejected, he traveled through his lands, fighting dragons, a conquering hero. Somewhere along the way, it occurred to him, maybe the voice was intimidated by that large army. So he returned alone and knocked at the castle door. "It is I, the prince, alone this time." "There is only room for one of us," the beautiful voice replied. Dejected, he wandered for years. What had he done wrong that he could not be admitted to the castle? Then he wondered, maybe it's my princely status. Maybe that's intimidating. So a few months later, he went back. "Who is it?" asked the voice. Humbly he said, "It is I, just a man." "There's only room for one of us," the voice replied. 7 more years, the prince wandered, seeking wisdom only from the stars and the wildness inside of him. Finally, he returned to the castle and knocked at the door. "Who is it?" asked the voice. "It is thou," responded the prince, and the door was opened to him. Paul reminds his church in Corinth that the emphasis on individual egos is not where it's at. Who is Apollos? Who is Paul? I don't know about you, but I picture Apollos as some golden-haired, prince-like character. Whoever he was continuing to build the church that Paul had started. The Corinthian congregation was getting caught up in personality, it seems like, focusing on individual egos rather than the way of love. And I want to emphasize here, no individual is responsible for the success or failure of any endeavor. All of us are building on what others have done. And if anything good is going to happen, it's because God is involved. Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. You can't make a plant grow. I am trying with this tree, but I've been told you can water, you can give it sunlight, you can care for it, you can fertilize, but God alone gives the growth. And that brings us to the last stage of our sequence here, showing up. Richard Rohr reckons that only 2% of the people show up. That's the final stage. I'd like to be a little more optimistic. Showing up is about giving back, about taking your spiritual growth and using it in service to others. And I'm not sure I buy into all of this as a linear sequence. It feels more likely to me it's something seasonal, more like a cycle we go through. There are times when we feel more empowered to give back. There are times when we deeply experience God's presence in our lives, when ego recedes. There are times when we're more open to gaining insight on our patterns and we're more ready to change. And there's times when we are able to be more mature in our behavior throughout life. We are all showing up, waking up, cleaning up, and growing up all the time throughout our lives. Whatever is happening with us, it is God who is supplying the growth within our individual lives, within our families, and within our church. And growth, it seems, is the nature of God's work in the world. And sometimes growth can mean change, which is difficult for some of us. But it's something to think about. On the cusp of spring, as we prepare to enter the season of Lent, maybe we're noticing just some hints of new growth in our own lives and things that are forming around us. Yeah, some of us are expecting babies or grandbabies. But these hints are promising something that is new and alive. So let's welcome God's growth in all its forms this year and see how God is transforming us for what is to come. Amen.